All righty. Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Arts in Changing Political Landscapes, developed in partnership with Justice and Joy. My name is Jamie Sharp, and I am the program manager here at Grantmakers in the Arts. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a light-skinned Black person. My hair is in a fro today. I have on a blue sweater with some cherries, and I'm in my 20s. GIA is headquartered on the unceded land of the Lenape and Wappinger peoples. We ask you to join in acknowledging the Lenape and Wappinger communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. As a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded and shared, so if you have to hop off early, no worries at all. And I would also like to take a minute to review the Zoom features so that you have an optimal experience with us today. If you have a question for our tech team during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat function and message LGCtech_Jess. You can also use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our presenters. If you would like your experience to include live captioning, select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitles. In an era of constant change, from shifts in federal leadership and legislative priorities to evolving funding strategies and growing polarization in the public sphere, arts grantmakers face a unique moment of reflection and action. How can we learn from the culture wars of the past to navigate today's challenges and reimagine the future of arts and policy funding? Today, we will hear from research and evaluation consultant, Dr. Liz Dykman, and Vanessa Cooksey, President and CEO of the Regional Arts Commission of St. Louis. As always, we encourage our attendees to share firsthand experience and engage with one another in the chat. But we ask that we maintain focus and attention to our speakers who have graciously prepared today's presentations. The objective of our discussion is to reflect on the findings of historical liberation movement known as the Culture Wars and examine a case study on how those learnings have been implemented. This space is not meant to offer immediate advice or solutions in response to recent executive orders or ongoing federal activities. GIA encourages attendees and our broader membership to utilize takeaways from this webinar to continue organizing in support of arts and culture. And without further ado, I will pass it to Dr. Liz Dykman.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I am so excited to be here today. I will be discussing my research at the intersection of arts and public policy, which investigates congressional debates over federal government support of the arts and subsequent policy changes in the 1990s. While my research really focuses on federal government and a certain time period, I believe that the findings are relevant and applicable to all levels of government and today's political landscape. I hope that the findings offer new insights and important lessons that are valuable now. Before we discuss research findings, I want to really quickly acknowledge that I wrote my PhD dissertation on this topic. I am a huge policy wonk and very excited to talk about it. So if there are any different concepts, research findings that we talk about today that are a little too in the weeds or technical, please make sure to ask any questions during the Q&A section. I will be happy to clarify. So before we are able to really talk about any findings, I want to set the scene a little bit. So there are three really important factors that play into these debates over the culture wars in the 1990s. So there are political polarization, the culture wars, and macro political intervention. So we're all probably familiar now with political polarization to some extent. And this is really the clear division of politics into staunchly liberal and conservative camps that aligns ideology with partisanship. So that is to say, when we say liberal, it becomes synonymous with Democrat, and we say conservative, it becomes synonymous with Republican. And it really is associated with the disappearance of political moderates. And in the 1980s, we began to see some increasing partisanship around the arts. And some political scientists, kind of raised a red flag and said, we're, interested in what this means for the NEA in the near future. Lo and behold, by the 1990s, we see partisanship over federal arts policy reach new heights. The second factor are the culture wars. Now, in arts literature or in arts spaces, we tend to talk about this as a specific time period, but it's actually a formal theory in sociology. And it really refers to cultural conflict being resolved in politics. So I'm going to be referring to it in that way throughout my presentation, and not necessarily as a time period. And, leading up to the debates over the culture wars in the 1990s, there are a couple of really important things that start to happen. There's a coalition of conservative religious groups that become really interested in preserving traditional religious and family values. And what they essentially start to do is mobilize over issues of morality in entertainment. So they do everything from ban commercials by Pepsi Cola that had Madonna's Like a Prayer. They were behind 2 Live Crew's third album being the first sound recording to ever be ruled obscene. And they did lots of other things. It is all to say that they were really effective, and it was pretty clear that art was an attractive battleground in the culture wars because it was highly subjective, symbolic, and really touched on these moral values. Now, the last factor is the focus of my research, and something that I think is under-discussed, if you will, especially in art spaces, and that's congressional intervention or macro political intervention. So my research really tests the political science theory that states public policy change is not gradual and incremental, but really it tends to be disjoint and episodic because political institutions like Congress can only pay attention to a small number of issues at a time. So most of the time, issue areas, whether they be the arts or nuclear power or aviation safety, just don't get attention from Congress because they simply don't have the attention or capacity to do so. Instead, Congress really gives control over these small issue areas to subject matter experts who then essentially lead policy and also really, rely on positive narratives about that policy topic area to continue to stay in control of it. And when this happens, policy change is incremental and gradual. They're probably incremental and rare. Now, when issues do get the attention of Congress, it's because they're questioned in public and really start to cause conflict. And this is what we call a macro political intervention because Congress or another political institution essentially starts to assert control over a policy area. So at this point in time, the policy area is no longer the domain of subject matter experts, but of Congress. And policy change can happen quickly and substantially here because there's a new set of decision makers with new values, and they also have a different way of making decisions, which is voting. So my research really focuses, as I said, on the 1990s, but I do study the 5 years before and after what we call kind of the, what I call the years of crisis, to better understand how they differ from essentially 1989 to 1995 or 1996, which are the years of crisis. And so I really do focus my research on federal arts policy and in particular, the National Endowment for the Arts. So I will likely use those things interchangeably throughout the presentation. And while the NEA is the largest public funder of arts and also the flagship of American federal arts policy, I do want to acknowledge that it's actually only one of 300 estimated federal programs, activities, and services for arts and humanities. So there are 2 main things that we're going to be talking about today. The first is political statements in Congress, and the second is policy change from 1989 to 1995 for federal arts policy. And I want to make clear that while I believe the culture wars and political polarization amplified the conflict over federal arts policy, they're not necessarily the main driver of it. Let me explain a little bit. So at first, we have the Mapplethorpe, Serrano, and NEA 4 controversies in the early 1990s, 1989 and 1991, that really brought unprecedented attention to federal arts policy. So during this time, the conservative religious groups that I mentioned before were really well organized and poised to take action on these issues, and they really raised the alarm to Congress. So federal arts policy really became entangled in the culture wars, and the kinds of debates that were raised at this time were really around what, if any, content standards there were for publicly funded art. And ultimately, this debate led to the ban on obscene artwork, and that played out ultimately with the 1998 Supreme Court case, Finley versus NEA, which upheld the consideration of general standards of decency and respect in NEA grant guidelines. Now, political polarization, as I mentioned, really was spotted in the 1980s, but we really see it reach new heights in the 1990s, especially in the later years. So in 1994, we have the Republican Revolution, which was the first time that Republicans controlled Congress in 40 years, since 1952. So this really empowered those who opposed federal arts policy to take action on their legislative agendas. So, and I want to make a note here about that by 1996, the official Republican Party platform actually called for the privatization of the NEA. And really during this time, the debate shifts from morality to what, if any, role the federal government has in funding the arts. So while the culture wars and political polarization, I think, really contributed to the crisis over the federal arts policy, I don't necessarily believe that they were the primary cause of it. Instead, congressional intervention in federal arts policy best explains the emergence, timing, scale, and nature and conflict that we see. Let me show you why as we talk about these research findings that we're going to go through. So, as I mentioned before, when an arts policy issue is no longer, or any policy issue is not seen positively anymore, but starts to be questioned in public, it gets the attention of Congress. So what I wanted to examine was how, if at all, statements in Congress about federal arts policy changed over time, and two, if changes in statements were related to the amount of congressional attention to federal arts policy. So to understand how statements changed over time, or conceptual congressional understandings of federal arts maybe more appropriately, identify key statements, both negative and positive, about federal arts policy in the congressional record. So for reference, the congressional record is literally a record of everything that is said on the congressional floor. It has all of the daily accounts and proceedings from the House of Representatives, Senate, and any of their committees. I also looked at the number of times that the NEA was mentioned in the congressional record to really understand the attention that was being, the attention that it had at that time, and if it was creating conflict and if it was visible. And I want to make a note really quickly before we get any further. As you can see on this slide, I talk about policy entrepreneurs, and think about them as business entrepreneurs, if you will, in politics. There are political actors who are really trying to leverage their position to further their own policy ends. There's a small group of them, and they're really leaders within their own parties. So let's look at the findings presented in the graph. So before what I call the crisis years of 1989 to 1995, almost 9 in 10 statements about federal arts policy in Congress were positive. This is also when we had the fewest mentions of the NEA in the congressional record, signaling that federal arts policy received little, if any, attention from Congress at this time. And no wonder, because everyone understood federal arts policy at that time very positively. Now, when we look at the years of crisis, starting in 1989, there was over a 900% increase in the total number of statements about federal arts policy in the congressional record. So clearly at this time, federal arts policy had the attention of Congress. Statements that were really positive towards the NEA dropped from 89% in the preceding years to 58%, thanks to a really large surge in negative statements, which represents really the emergence of these questions and conflict about federal arts policy. In 1989 and 1991, those were actually the 2 years in which statements that opposed the NEA outnumbered statements that were in favor of the NEA. And I think that it's, probably not a coincidence that those are the years that we saw the biggest controversies, Mapplethorpe, Serrano, and the NEA for. Now, when we look at the total number of statements made about the NEA, it dropped off by about 1/3 starting in 1996, signaling that Congress probably wasn't paying as much attention to it at that time. And to be fair, if you're familiar with politics at that time, there was a lot going on. So pro-NEA statements at this time started to outnumber anti-NEA statements 3-1. And we really see actually that attention started to peak in Congress in just 1 year, 1997. And as a little bit of context, that's the year that NEA policymakers that were in favor of the NEA really responded in force to a call from House Speaker Newt Gingrich to eliminate the NEA. There were also 6 attempts to zero out the budget and 1 proposal to fund the arts via block grants. I want to point out really quickly before moving on that media attention really looks similar to congressional attention this time. Not only one, did it increase substantially, it went from being covered in about 100 newspapers nationwide to about 1,000 newspapers starting in 1989. And as you can imagine, that also meant that it was covered in many more newspapers. So instead of, being covered in the arts and culture section of the New York Times and Washington Post, all of a sudden, smaller cities are now talking about the arts in a way they haven't. So the next big research question I want to take a closer look at congressional tone at this point in time. So these are statements that I identified in the congressional debate over NEA. I want to emphasize the importance of political language in policymaking. Politicians use language to influence how we understand problems and solutions in government, which ultimately impacts legislation. Often language like these statements describe congressional understanding of an issue, not necessarily the reality of an issue. So we're going to talk a little bit about the most popular statements, but I also want to make a comment that it's really clear in this research that the congressional understanding is dynamic and responsive, and it changes over time. And that's really important because we were interested in understanding how it changed, or if it changed at all, during the years of crisis. And I really want to talk about 2 major frames. The one that was most popular among anti-NEA statements was art content. And this was really the most effective statement that we see out of any of these. And it was really a vehicle for change, and they introduced a new negative tone about federal arts policy in Congress. It increased over 17,000% from what I call the pre-crisis period, 1984 to 1988, to the years of crisis. And really, Congress essentially kind of borrowed some language from those conservative religious groups that I mentioned that had mobilized over morality issues and entertainment, and really started to leverage those debates in Congress. And I want to make a couple of notes here. First is that, the charge in language was really led by policy entrepreneurs, as I mentioned, the small group of Republicans that had more extreme views than most Republicans. I will also say that there were a significant amount of NEA supporters that agreed the Mapplethorpe and Serrano artworks supported in part by the NEA were offensive. And so they kind of committed violated the most basic rule of political language possible, and is that don't recite the opposing language. And because what they essentially did was refer to the statement, which really strengthened it and also strengthened the position of those that oppose their views in Congress. And I want to now turn towards the most popular statements for those that supported the NEA. And I think it's really important to note that freedom of expression was a really important one during the years of crisis. However, it wasn't as effective, I believe, as art content, because it really simply it didn't have the same sort of motive appeal. And also, interestingly, it's, really a statement that's relegated to arts policy and doesn't have the same sort of traction or hasn't been used as much in other policy fields, which again, doesn't make it as strong. The most popular pro-NEA statements at this time ended up being education and economy. So this language was really bolstered by both research and also advocacy from national arts groups. And another study also found that, over time, those that supported the NEA found it much more effective to discuss the instrumental value of the arts. because it broadened their appeal and it really helped them face new opposition. And I think it's a testament to both economy and education that they remain some of the most popular statements now that we use to advocate for the arts. So I think we have established here that policy entrepreneurs really successfully changed the tone of federal arts policy in Congress, and it increased visibility and conflict over it. So now we're going to turn our attention to a new research question. So as we also discussed earlier, federal arts policy now we know had the attention of Congress. And when it did, we now start to have to ask, what does that mean for policy change? So at this point in time, Congress is really poised to act on legislation, federal policy legislation. And we also know that means that most likely that small domain of experts are really no longer or possibly not going to be in charge of that policy area for long. So here we're examining two different things. One, if and when if and to what extent Congress proposed and took legislative action on federal arts policy, which is what we call being on the congressional agenda. And two, if policy changed quickly and substantially. So here we're looking at two different things to understand if Congress intervened in federal arts policy issues by putting them on their agenda. We're looking at the total number of times NEA has mentioned the congressional record again. We're essentially getting a sense of how much it's discussed. And we're also looking at the proposed legislation or legislation introduced to Congress about the NEA, which includes amendments, bills, resolutions, laws, everything. And I looked at policy change in two different ways. First, changes to NEA's annual appropriations or program budgets, and two, changes that gave or revoked authority of groups or individuals to make decisions about federal arts policy and to significantly impacted grant-making policy or outcomes. So looking at the graph again, in 1984 to 1988, the number of proposed legislation and mentions of the NEA in Congress indicate that federal arts policy was still the domain of experts and not Congress, i.e. is not on the congressional agenda. There was only one substantial policy change to federal arts policy. So really, it seems like at this time, Congress deferred to subject matter experts on federal arts policy, so policy change was rare and incremental. Now, when we get to 1989 to 1995, it's clear that Congress intervened in federal arts policy. This period had a 572% increase in legislation introduced to Congress than the preceding years, and had the most legislation introduced of any of the three time periods. Federal arts policy was clearly on the congressional agenda. They were really proposing legislation and passing legislation at this time. And so it's not surprising that we start to see substantive policy change. There were 4 substantive policy changes in this time. And I want to note that partisanship at this point started to play a really pivotal role in policymaking. I analyzed congressional roll call votes on legislation about the NEA from 1990 to 2000 and found that the divide over federal arts policy grew exponentially during this crisis period. So by the time we get to 1996 to 2000, federal arts policy was still on the congressional agenda, but probably not as much of a priority. Compared to the crisis period, legislation introduced to Congress dropped by half, and NEA mentions in congressional records dropped by about 1/3. Interestingly, there were about 8 substantive policy changes, though, which is about twice as many as the crisis years from 1989 to 1995. And I think there's a couple of reasons why this might be. First is that the policy entrepreneurs at this time introduced a total of 24 pieces of legislation. That is more than 1/4 of all of the legislation introduced in the crisis period. For comparison, Democrats introduced only 1/3. So they were almost roughly equal, these 3 policy entrepreneurs and all Democrats. The other thing is that, in these later years, Republicans had the majority in Congress, and they also chaired the Appropriations and Subcommittee that had purview over the NEA. So that is to say that they really had the ability to take action on their preferred governmental decisions or preferences. So at this point, I think findings show that federal arts policy really changed substantially when it was the domain of Congress, and when it's the domain of experts, it changed incrementally. Let's take a really quick look at policy change. So this is a summary and by no means a full list of federal arts policy change from 1984 to 2000. Again, when federal arts policy was the domain of experts in 1984 to 1988, there were few substantial policy changes. In 1989, Congress intervened in federal arts policy and made substantive policy changes through proposing and voting on legislation that reflected their values. The congressional intervention in federal arts policy that we have seen over these past two research questions was amplified by the culture wars. The content of controversial grant awards were ripe for battle over moral issues in Congress and really brought unprecedented attention to federal arts policy. And political polarization, as we've been talking about, played a really important role, especially as the years went on. For most of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, federal arts policy really enjoyed largely bipartisan support, but we see that begin to deteriorate in the 1980s, and then especially in the 1990s became really profoundly polarized and started to really impact congressional intervention. And I want to point out something here. So we previously had talked about the role that language plays, influencing how we understand problems and solutions in government, which ultimately affects legislation. Art content is a great example of this relationship. So let me explain a little bit more. As you remember, art content were these political statements that NEA grant awards benefit the creation or exhibition of artwork that is shocking, not legitimate, and obscene. And so arguably it was the most effective political statement that we saw during the crisis years. And it's probably then not surprising that when we know that that's the most effective language being used, that we see legislation like the obscenity clause, which was passed in 1990, that banned the NEA from supporting artwork or artists that made obscene or indecent materials. So we can start to see the through line between the language that we see in Congress and the legislation that they pass. And I want to end by just quickly talking about how some of these findings, I think, relate back to today. And I want to stress again the importance of political language in, shaping policy problems, policy solutions, and legislation. It's a very well-studied phenomenon in our society that we all have very different understandings of our world, of our political landscape, and that's in part driven by how many different news sources there are, how different they are, et cetera. I think more now than ever, language is really key to understanding political landscapes, but also the legislation that we see come out, because really it is shaping realities and perceptions of everyone in our country. The other thing that I just want to say anecdotally is that restrictions on art content continue to evolve. So, we talk about them during the 1990s as really being about grant funding for federal grants, but we can continue to, there are new boundaries, that there was not even really, really an internet at that point in time for most of these events. So we are now seeing, I think, the culture wars and restrictions on art playing out in different ways, much different than they had before, but still, over morality, values, et cetera. So a quick example I want to give is that I had previously had Robert Mapplethorpe's black and white photo Rosie as part of my presentation. And I actually had my Google account suspended because I had that picture in the presentation. I then went down a little bit of a rabbit hole and found out that the image is actually, from what I can tell, being taken down from some websites. I still have a lot more research to do, but going back through website archives made me realize that where I had downloaded the image before, it is no longer available. So I think that that's just an important lesson to keep in mind as we consider how politics and art are intersecting at this time. All right, thank you all so much. I'm going to hand it over now to Vanessa.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Liz. I deeply enjoy working with Liz. We have the benefit of being in St. Louis together, and we are very blessed to have her brilliance here in our region. My name is Vanessa Cooksey. I serve as the president and CEO of the Regional Arts Commission. I use she, her pronouns. I am wearing a yellow turtleneck with a green jacket and a silver necklace. My hair is braided, and I'm an African American female. I come to you today acknowledging that we exist and gather together on the ancestral homelands of the Osage Nation, the Missouri and the Illini Confederacy, who were removed unjustly, and that we in this community are the beneficiaries of that removal. We pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, and we honor them as we live, work, and create art here. My presentation today is really to localize the conversation that we've started and that we're having today. I want to give very specific examples of how the Regional Arts Commission has worked to navigate varying political landscapes and certainly give a case study of a benefit of a way that we have been able to navigate for the benefit of the arts and culture sector in St. Louis, but also the people of St. Louis in general. There we go. All politics is, you can fill in the blank. Some people say it's corrupt, it's great, it's good, it's bad, it's silly, the variety of words that we can use to describe politics. But today, my descriptor is all politics is local. I'd like to share one of my leadership principles is that of Sankofa, which is an African principle that looks back at history and the past and our ancestors and what's great and pulls it forward. It's an image of a bird holding an egg, but the feet are always moving forward. And I think that it's important to have historical context for how we got to the Regional Arts Commission, and certainly don't expect you to read all of these things, but just want to point out that as far back as the early 1800s, elected officials, governance leaders, civic leaders, business leaders have engaged the arts for supporting their interest. Oftentimes, that interest has been economic, it's been cultural, it has been to support or dominate or control. And so as I look over the history of the arts in the St. Louis region, I'd like to point out one particular event was the 1904 World's Fair that deeply shaped how St. Louis's culture advanced, and also from an economic perspective and population growth perspective was very pivotal and centering the arts and culture as a contributor to quality of life and economic development in St. Louis. Another central theme to the intersection of arts and politics is the presence of voters offering to approve or voting to approve tax support for the arts and publicity and helping to position St. Louis as a wonderful place to live, work, and visit. In the 19th century, that continues. In 1963, the Arts and Education Council was formed to bring more private funding to the arts. And again, we saw in the later half of the century, voters approving tax dollars to support the arts. And I think that's because St. Louis residents didn't want the arts to be a luxury or at risk of lack of inconsistent funding. And so in 1984, voters approved the Convention and Visitors Commission as well as the Regional Arts Commission funding through hotel occupancy tax. And that created a situation where we could ensure that the residents and the people that live in St. Louis could benefit from a robust arts and culture community, but also when people visit St. Louis from a tourism perspective, that there would be interesting and fun things to do. I noticed that there are several local arts agencies participating in this webinar, and it's great to be with you and understanding the ecosystem of arts funding and the presence and need for elected officials and governments to support the arts is really important, and the policies that support the arts. RAC was founded in 1985, and so this year we are celebrating our 40th anniversary, and we have spent the last 40 years welcoming visitors. Thank you, it's super exciting to celebrate this milestone. For the last 30 years, we have partnered with Americans for the Arts in the gathering of data for the Arts and Economic Prosperity Study, and we know that we have over 12 million visits, people who are coming to St. Louis or engaging in arts and culture activities, fostering change. We have an amazing program called the Community Arts Training Institute, or the CAT Institute, where we work with community members, social workers, entrepreneurs, and artists to solve local community problems. And one of the motto of the CAP program is with, not for, working with community versus for community and solving community. And then creating together. RAC's core focus is to promote, foster, and encourage the art, and we do that through grant making. So we provide general operating support grants, which many of you know how important that is to the sustainability of our arts organizations, program support grants for non-arts organizations that have arts programs, and then artist support grants. And so over the last 40 years, we have invested $115 million in the arts and culture ecosystem and sector here in St. Louis, which is producing $868 million in economic activity for this region. That's a pretty good return on investment as far as I'm concerned. If you put 115 in and get 868 out, that's really good. And the reason why I share this is because understanding the motivations and the interest of elected officials and business leaders around their engagement in the arts helps to shape the narrative in how we talk about the arts, not just for art's sake, but as an economic driver, as the sector that provides opportunities and resources for quality of life for people who live and visit this region. So I'd like to do a deep dive into a case study, ARPA for the Arts, which was a campaign and ultimately a grant program that RAC administered by receiving ARPA funds that were allocated to the city of St. Louis. The Regional Arts Commission receiving over 90% of its budget from hotel motel sales tax clearly had a big struggle in 2020 financially from the impacts of COVID. You know, travel, for all intents and purposes, ceased, and we went from an average of $6.7 million a year after having seen 2 to 3% revenue growth for 35 years to losing half of our income in 6 months. So the devastation was significant, and as go RAC, so goes the sector, because we are the largest public funder of the arts in St. Louis. And so in July of 2021, several leaders of our local arts organizations, both large and small, reached out to RAC and said, we should come together and advocate for ARPA dollars, because as individual organizations, we could go to our respective elected officials, the mayor, the county executive, board of aldermen, county council, and request relief funds because we clearly have been deeply impacted financially. And we could win individually or lose individually. But if we come together and advocate on behalf of RAC receiving these dollars, not only does RAC have decades of experience distributing public funds to artists and arts organizations, we know that RAC will do what needs to be done to continue to advance the sector. And so in July of 21, The sector, arts organizations, leaders, and board members, patrons, artists, established 5% for the arts campaign. And our request was 5% of the total allocation of ARPA funds that were received by the city of St. Louis as well as St. Louis County for a total of $35 million. And the case that we made started with the economics. We were able to say through our arts and economic prosperity study research and other research that we had done on the financial impacts of COVID to our sector, that we needed these resources to continue to recover. And so approaching our elected officials with the economic conversation first, and second, a quality of life conversation, and reminding them, do you remember in July of 2020 when you were tired of being in the house and we had impromptu concerts at the park? Our arts organizations worked really hard through the Missouri Arts Safety Alliance to ensure that we could reopen as quickly as possible and deliver arts and culture experiences indoors, outdoors. The arts and culture sector was one of the first sectors to continue to operate during the height of the pandemic, and how beneficial that was for people's social well-being, mental health well-being. And so it changed how elected officials and business leaders saw the value of the arts in helping support the recovery, and it elevated the economic impact of COVID on our sector to then warrant an investment. In October of 2022, the city of St. Louis passed Board Bill number 66, allocating $10.6 million to the Regional Arts Commission to support recovery in the sector. Through that campaign, in addition to emails, attending town halls, we sent artists, arts organization, our own commissioners to county council meetings, Board of Aldermen meetings every single week. We did not let up until the goal was met. And having a presence at the local level really made a difference, not only from a relationship building perspective, but also, just good old fashioned squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? So unfortunately, we did not receive an allocation from the county. So of the total $35 million ask, we came away with 10.6, which was tremendously helpful. And I do believe it would have been zero if we hadn't been proactive about advocating for these dollars and making the case. It was an extensive contractual, we were subrecipient agreements, subrecipients to the city of St. Louis to receive the actual funds. One of the things that we requested was to receive all the dollars up front. For those of you who received ARPA funds, some of them were administered on a reimbursement perspective, and RAC just was not in a position to spend dollars first and get reimbursed later. And so we worked through the board bill as well as the subrecipient agreement to ensure that we could administer these dollars in a way that made sense for RAC's capacity and staff and have the most positive impact. We made the commitment that we weren't going to hold on to these funds, and ultimately we would have them distributed within 18 months. We actually got it done in 15 months and made a final report. That's another touch point where we were very intentional about going back to the mayor and the Board of Aldermen every 6 months, sharing, here's what we've done with the money. Here's the impact that we've had. We had artists give testimonials, arts organizations, because oftentimes it's easy to not just be forgotten, but get sideways from a policy perspective because we don't follow up to say, here's what the impact is. I know Health and Human Services organizations tend to do really well with that, but arts organizations, for a variety of reasons, that's an area of growth for us. RAC was very intentional about having a positive impact on the sector with these dollars. ARPA money was really complex. It's not hotel, motel, occupancy tax. This not only did the rules change at the federal level along the way, but ensuring that RAC would take on a majority of the administrative burden of these funds, the reporting, the compliance, so that when we got it into the hands of artists and arts organizations, they could actually use it to create and to sustain themselves. So we focused our distribution on income replacement grants for artists, revenue replacement grants for organization, and aid to tourism and hospitality grants for both artists and arts organizations. And that took a lot of teamwork. We were very intentional about collaborating with the federal agency, the U.S. Department of Treasury. We established relationships there so that we could get real-time feedback on changes that were being made. And the city of St. Louis empowered the Community Development Administration to serve as the administrative compliance agency for all the ARPA funds that were coming into the city. And so it was so intentional. We had bi-weekly meetings to ensure we were staying on top of any changes, and they knew how we were distributing the dollars, particularly to artists and arts organizations. So what happened? We used 9%, so just under $1 million for administrative. We hired 3 people. And our whole entire organization, we've got a staff of about 15 people. Everybody at RAC worked on this, whether you were getting paid by ARPA money or not, because it was just that intense to receive this large influx of revenue and then work really diligently to distribute it. Grants by types, we did 194 grants to artists, 76 grants to organizations, and then geography. I point this out because the city of St. Louis was very intentional in wanting the ARPA funds to have an impact in areas of St. Louis that have been historically disinvested. And for us, that's North St. Louis. And so because the Community Development Administration had historically managed HUD funds for the city of St. Louis, Housing and Urban Development, there was intentionality around qualified census tract. And I've got a little, fine print here that you can see in the replay or in the materials that are posted. But this ensured that the resources that were provided to RAC were able to get to artists where there was the greatest need. So 82 of our grants were for organizations and artists in qualified census tracts, and 89 were not. So we wanted to ensure we had broad reach across the city, but also concentrated efforts where there had been historical disinvestment and the greatest need. Some highlights from ARPA for the Arts. We commissioned 28 murals, 2 in every ward. Last year was the first year that St. Louis went from 28 wards to 14. 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, the city was very intentional about reducing the number of wards. And so we wanted to mark this historical moment for the city of St. Louis by bringing arts and culture to the table and say this is a unique opportunity for community engagement, community voice, community visioning. So let's center artists in the visioning for what we want St. Louis to look and feel and experience going forward in these new wards. So we did 2 murals in every ward, one to acknowledge the history of the ward, but also to cast a vision for the culture of that ward and the residents coming together. So the impact of the St. Louis Mural Project has been beyond our wildest imagination, both from an earned media perspective, but just the residents' response to the murals and bringing people together, and continuing to do that has been phenomenal. We established a learning cohort of grantees who received the tourism dollars. So some of our larger arts organizations like the Symphony, the Rep, National Blues Museum, are coming together on a quarterly basis to learn from each other, because certainly COVID fundamentally changed how people experience and what they want from arts. And so RAC taking leadership of pulling arts organizations together to learn from each other and for us to hear in real time what the needs are was a little better than just having them submit reports on a quarterly basis. We've also invested in 5 filmmakers, $100,000 grants to local filmmakers. So we want to, again, the focus of these dollars is not only to have a positive social impact, but also a meaningful, measurable economic impact. And then last but not least, we opened up a pop-up location at City Foundry, which is one of the top tourist destinations in our region. And that serves as a place for grantees and art, both organizations and artists to host events and get access to new audiences, new patrons. So very intentional about both the social benefits and the economic benefits of utilizing the ARPA funds. So what's next? More partnerships. I think the work of local arts agencies is God's work for sure. If you're not working with your local arts agency, find one. Public-private partnerships are the way to go. And what we've been able to do with these ARPA funds is bring people together. This is a picture of our wrap-up event where we had our elected officials, artists, business owners, community residents together in City Hall celebrating something positive. Board Bill 66 was unanimously approved by the Board of Aldermen. And please believe we have our fair share of dysfunction locally in our municipal politics, but I'm proud of the fact that the arts has the power to bring people together and keep people together if we start with that intention. And so RAC will continue to invest in creatives, arts and cultural organizations, and public art. We want to amplify the stories of our artists. Best kept secret doesn't work. It doesn't work for the artists and arts organizations who are improving the quality of life and experience that we have in our respective communities. And we want to be able to share and invite people in. And then convening people. We really want to focus on cross-sector collaborations, innovation. I'd say let's keep art at the center of what is positive and good that is happening in our local communities, because certainly we are always in a position of responding to the politics at the federal level, state level, and local level. But as we work to protect what is good about arts and culture, bringing people together and keeping people together, I think is our highest and best work. Thank you. I'm super excited about the Q&A and looking forward to your questions. RAC is always available to connect, either on our website. Our social media is amazing, and feel free to email. I represent the org. I have an amazing team of colleagues, grant makers, communicators. And so if there's anything that I've shared that you'd like to take a deeper dive into, please send an email to info@racstl.org, and I'm happy to connect with you directly and or put you in touch with our team members who are committed to ensuring that St. Louis is a great place to live, work, and visit. So turning it back to Jamie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And thank you as well, Liz. We're going to dive into our Q&A. Before we do, I just want to remind attendees that this space is not meant to offer immediate advice or solutions in response to recent executive orders or ongoing federal activities. Also, because I see that we have a very lively chat, which is awesome, I would encourage folks to drop their questions in the Q&A box, which can be found in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, just so we make sure we aren't losing any questions. There was one that came up. Liz, where can we find your research? And I think they may mean possibly like the entirety of like your dissertation, if that's available online anywhere.
It sure is. Yeah, I can drop a link in the chat if that's okay.
Yeah, perfect. And we'll be sure to send that link out to all of our registrants as well. And then there's another question. It says, in the previous presentation, so I think, Liz, this is for you, it was mentioned that a certain increased percentage of NEA funding went to SSAs over the years, we covered what is an SSA.
Oh, I'm so sorry. If I said SSA, that's probably a typo, and that's supposed to be SAA, State Arts Agencies. So my apologies if that caused any confusion.
No worries, no worries. Vanessa, there are many questions from folks about the grantee cohort. So could you give us a little bit more insight on the pros and cons of going through that process?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So we have about 25 arts organizations that were awarded very large grants, anywhere from $200,000 to $600,000 for this aid to tourism and hospitality recovery. And the intention was not only to support the general operations of these arts organizations who had lost lots of money during the pandemic, but also um, through a separate MOU, encourage them to make broader investments in marketing and communication. And that's, to me, inextricably tied to audience development and revenue generation. And so we quarterly invite the executive directors, CEOs of these arts organizations for both reporting on how did you spend the money, but also what issues are you seeing in your respective organizations. And the meetings are about 2 hours, and we have them, at a day and time that tends to work. We plan them in advance. And the pros are just the learning for RAC. It's real-time learning that ultimately influences our grant making. But the connectivity, because what I find is our arts leaders want to get together, but they don't have time. And so to have a third party do the coordination, send out the invites, do the polling and all of that, and say, hey, you all be here. We'll have the snacks and the water and everything. You just show up, bring yourselves. Sometimes there's pre-work, sometimes there's not. Um, it's of value to them because they don't often have the chance to connect, and natural collaborations and or just opportunities to share information and resources is super important. And then this last thing I'll say in terms of a pro is it's ultra important, not just for arts leaders and for us in general, for people to feel like they're not alone. I think part of the narrative of what's happening across the board is to isolate, to disconnect, to have people feel like, you're crazy for asking for help, or, just telling the truth. And sometimes doesn't even feel like it's appropriate. And so pulling folks together so they know they're not alone, and their support not only helps professional development, leadership development, but it gives us insight into trends that RAC can then respond to before they become a crisis.
Thank you. Liz, a question for you. Can you say more about how NEA grant review panels were reformed or changed in the 90s, and if those changes are still in place today?
Yeah, pretty much all of the changes we talked about are still in place today. I want to make that note, like truly the 1990s is the reality that we're living now in terms of policy change. I think this is a really great example of political language, so I'm going to be a little bit of a policy wonk again. And I want to highlight that, when we were looking at the different political statements that were really popular during the 1990s, one of them was elitism. So there was a really strong argument that the NEA was very elite, and that one of the ways that they really perpetuated this elitism was through their grant panels, because they had subject matter experts in a field review the grants of their friends, maybe their own organization. So there was a lot of perception that there was a conflict of interest there, and also that by having subject matter experts review grants, they had a different set of values around art than maybe the average American. So the really big change was to require that lay people, which are technically, I believe the definition is that anyone who can be interested in the arts, but they are not employed in the arts, had to be on grant panels. So that was the big change. I believe also, though, that the NEA had to, I think, submit new reports to Congress about their criteria and about their panel composition. But really, it was about elitism. So the language translated to legislation about really diversifying panels.
Thank you. A question for both of you. How do you think communications professionals can lend their expertise to grantee organizations during this time of political uncertainty within the arts?
Liz, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind is really helping tell this effectively, telling the stories that are going on in the arts. You know, arts organizations are asked to do a lot of different things, and it's a lot to collect, you know, everything from, it might be data, it might be testimonials, whatever it may be to help shape and really form those stories, to do photography, whatever it may be. I think that a lot of organizations I know, at least, I think would really appreciate the help of better telling their stories and also telling the stories of the sector overall, because truly we rely on a couple of large research reports to advocate for the arts. But I think the more we can do to amplify not only the messages we see in those reports, like economic impact or the benefits of education for arts and education, the more I think we can tell human stories about, you know, stories how they really impact people's lives. I think that that is incredibly effective. And frankly, when we're talking about advocacy for different policy topic areas, like we can make the economic argument for pretty much any policy topic area. I think what really makes the arts unique is being able to capture these stories about how they impact us as individuals.
And I would say, bringing it to the individual and personal level, I do not allow people to say three things in front of me: artsy fartsy, starving artist, or I'm not creative. Like, no, I'm not having that, because oftentimes when elected officials or business folks are in a room talking about arts policy, someone invariably will say something silly, I'm using kind words, about, well, you know, that arts is a luxury, or, oh, I did my arts thing by going to the symphony last week. No, we're a meaningful sector. We're a meaningful industry. We're driving economic value. There's 12,000 jobs that this sector provides in this region. You know, your neighbor five down the streets probably works in the arts, right? Five houses down. So just helping people connect the impact of the arts and its relevance in our day-to-day lives. And, you know, you pick up these phones, good grief, how we engage with the arts through a technology perspective, what careers are available to us. And so, correcting the narrative in individual conversations, I think, is as important as correcting the narratives in these broader media narratives.
Yeah, thank you both. And as a follow-up, someone asks if there are any resources or additional research around the impact of arts investment on the economy. And also, if any folks who are here in the webinar have any resources to share in the chat as well. Again, that's resources around impact of arts investment on the economy.
I would say, I think Gina is here from AFTA. They do a wonderful job of campaign language, data, like all the things over decades. So Americans for the Arts provides excellent resources for why the arts are important from an economic perspective, social perspective, how to support policies, how to galvanize folks. So I would start there. And then it looks like there's some other good resources happening in the chat as well. And
And
your local arts agency, your local arts agency.
I also have to really quickly acknowledge that I'm pretty sure the Arts and Economic Impact Study started in the 1990s specifically to help advocate for the arts during this time, if I remember correctly. So I think are we on 6 or 7 now?
Yeah, we'll be doing 7. We just finished
7
6, so we have
districts. Okay.
30 years of data.
That's incredible. That's incredible because it's not only high quality, it is like literally designed by economists, but we also have it over a really long period of time. So you can, you know, add up, if you will, the economic impact in any one city, state, country for a really long time. So I just, you know, completely agree with Vanessa there. That's, I think, a great place to start.
Great.
Awesome, thank you. Then there's a question: how are we tracking and optimizing revenue produced by arts and culture? And a follow-up to that is, are there any ideas on streamlining revenue and directing circulation?
I think that's an area we can do better. I know from RAC's perspective, we've created a research and evaluation department within RAC in the last 4 years to not only help hold RAC accountable for its stewardship of public funds, of tax dollars, but also be able to help count where resources are. And in addition to changes politically, I know that we've seen some change here in the corporate philanthropy ecosystem and landscape with, dollars declining in some areas. And so being able to track how arts organizations are receiving funds, the kinds of funds, and supporting their efforts to diversify revenue. So I think counting revenue is an issue. Actually, Liz did some research for RAC about 3 years ago for our board staff retreat, where we looked into that and saw some over-reliance on, what was it, contributed funds versus earned income. So I think as a sector, we can do better. Liz, what are your thoughts?
This is like a super data person answer, so I just want to acknowledge that. But I spend a lot of time looking at IRS 990s, and that's exactly the research that I conducted for Vanessa. But really, you can get very detailed information in very high quality standardized data. And if you're a data person, you know that's important. About literally any nonprofit has to submit an IRS 990 to the government, which is a lot of them, or at least ones that have receipts over $50,000. The other place you can look to are dependent upon what kind of arts nonprofits you have. You might be able to find any information in their annual reports. They might publish information if they're part of a state, local, or federal government. They most likely have some sort of budget published somewhere. So those are kind of more technical ways, I think, to go about finding that information, but they can be highly effective.
Secretaries of state also for registrations and those kinds of things. I think the more we can work together to create synergy and collaborations and broader databases, clearinghouses would be, useful for our time and effort.
Yeah, thank you. For Vanessa, what has been the long tail impact of the ARPA campaign in St. Louis and the learnings that RAC took away from the experience? Is it to talk about economic impact in tourism and veer away from political discourse, not to utilize the art for art's sake language, or something else?
Thank you for that question. I think for ARPA for the Arts, the immediate benefit was to provide cash resources to artists and arts organizations that need it. The long-term benefits of our investment, I think, is still too early to tell. Some of our projects are still being implemented, and so we'll be tracking that. I am very interested to see 5 years from now what these investments that we've made, particularly on the tourism side, will yield. My intention and goal is not to replace the social benefits of the arts, the quality of life benefits of the arts in our conversation. It's to add the economic benefits of the arts so that people will recognize its full value and contribution to the community. Because oftentimes people will very easily name the social, emotional, familial, community benefits of the arts. But and most of the time, people aren't even aware of the economic value of the arts. And so for me, it's a both and. I want people to talk about the economic value and the social value. Randy Cohen from AFTA says, no stories without numbers, no numbers without stories. And that's what's motivating how RAC is talking about the arts in this region.
Thank you. We have another question here. My agency is looking to leverage our committed state funds with city/county arts funding for the very first time. Do you or anyone else on the call have case studies for percent for art policies? Would love to learn from other challenges and successes.
Yes, RAC does. The city of St. Louis does have a percent for art policy in place. It has not been funded. There were several exemptions and exceptions. So I would say, certainly reach out to your local arts agency to identify. You're welcome to reach out to RAC, of course, for our experience. But the key to any policy, and I've found this both with from ARPA to our own Missouri statute that created RAC, it's the exemptions where you have to manage or see the difference in how impactful a policy can be and or the restrictions that are associated with the policy. So just make sure that whatever your elected officials are passing, it will actually do what you intend for it to do. Liz, your thoughts?
There are, I'll be honest, I can't remember some of these resources off the top of my head, but I do know I've looked into this before. If you go to Google Scholar, or I think there's a list somewhere that someone has been keeping track of percent for art policy. There's a lot of good information out there, that is all to say. And I'm sure that there are others on this call who might be able to provide some of their experiences as well in the chat.
Thank you. And our last question, who should or could be telling the overall story of the sector and its benefits?
Everybody. Everybody is responsible. More specifically, certainly the artists and arts organizations who are creating the work, the funders. Why do we invest in this? We could do a whole lot of things with our resources. We're making an active commitment. We are grant makers in the arts, and we find value in making this investment. And we need to talk about it. Children need to talk about it. Residents need to talk about it. Visitors need to talk about it. Having some consistency on what the key messages are, the social benefits. It's what makes us human. I mean, good grief. We have this creative faculty that we benefit from. And so being able to name, this is how we want to consistently talk about our sector, our work, our community is really important. But I think leaving someone out of the conversation or leaving a group out of the conversation only weakens the ultimate value that this work has to humanity.
Yeah, I think anyone who cares has a part to play. Anyone who wants to see the arts thrive has a part to play. And I hope we can all do that in many different ways. Vanessa had previously talked about how we can do that at the individual level. We can do that when we volunteer to help with, at different arts organizations in our communities. We, are not only act as ambassadors, but amplify their impact. There's so many different ways, I think, to help tell the story and be a part of it. And I hope that everyone can find the way that makes the most sense for them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. Today's webinar provided insights into shifting political landscape and its impact on arts and culture. As policies and funding priorities evolve, it is essential to remain vigilant, proactive, and unified in advancing the role of the arts in shaping just and inclusive communities. By understanding these changes and implications, we can better understand how our advocacy and investments can uphold cultural expression, self-determination, and equitable access to resources. At GIA, we remain steadfast in our commitment to ensuring that the funding field responds to these challenges with courage and accountability, centering racial justice and collective action in our approach. We invite you to join us in this ongoing work, strengthening advocacy, deepening community partnerships, and leveraging our collective power to sustain a thriving arts ecosystem that reflects and uplifts all voices. Thank you again so much to Vanessa and to Liz. Thank you to Justice and Joy for partnering with us on today's webinar. And thank you to our technician, Jess. We encourage you to provide us with feedback about your experience for today. We will have a link dropped in the chat, and you can also use the QR code on the screen. Webinar registrants will also receive a follow-up email with resources from our speakers and recording of today's webinar. And we hope that you can join us on April 1st for Rooted in Resilience, Cultural Self-Determination in Border Communities. Thank you so much, everyone.
Charges help the